Thank you. This is fine, right? You can all hear me, good. Well, thank you for attending. Ray Monk, who spoke last night, is a hard act to follow. I think we all enjoyed it greatly. And I have in addition to following Ray, I have the added burden of representing a bit of philosophy in this Wittgenstein week, which I hope will be of some interest. I'm going to be picking up on some themes that Ray introduced yesterday. I've got a kind of modest ambition for tonight. I just want to illustrate a few of Wittgenstein's persisting themes, themes that I think are central to his wider project of understanding how it is that we find meaning. And hearing Ray's talk yesterday, this is, of course, meaning in the narrow and academic sense of the meaning of language and other representational systems, but also meaning in life. These are themes which are familiar to most of you who have read some Wittgenstein, and they were also central to Wittgenstein's activities in the years 1926 to 29, when he was engaged with the design and construction of the Kundmangasse. So, we'll have okay, so these are the three themes that I aim to illustrate. First of all, aspect seeing, or seeing as. Secondly, the distinction between saying and showing as vehicles of communication. And thirdly, the notion of forms of life. It's an elusive notion referring to a fundamental web of practices which define a person's or a community's way of inhabiting both his natural and social world. We heard a bit about forms of life yesterday in the context of linguistic and logical and theoretical practices. But Wittgenstein's idea that forms of life, these fundamental practices, form the bedrock, really applies in every dimension of human experience, including our experience of value, ethical, aesthetic, religious, and cultural value. Now, I'm not very good with this microphone, so will you wave if I wander off and you can't hear? Now, in illustrating these themes, I'll also be promoting, not arguing for, just sort of promoting some ideas in the philosophy of art. The first is that works of art often, although not always, reveal aspects of the objects or events or experiences that they're about. And that these revealed aspects are often, although not always, evaluative. They have to do with norms that infuse our lives with point and purpose, with norms of truth and goodness, beauty, and the rest. So these evaluative aspects are wide-reaching and in every case valence. They're usually positive or negative. Secondly, I'm going to be, as I'm going to be discussing a couple of works of art with a view to illustrating the way in which they show rather than say what they have to communicate. And thirdly, I'm going to be focusing on works of art that reveal aspects of human experience which lie outside of our familiar forms of life, and which are good candidates for what Wittgenstein referred to as the inexpressible or ineffable. Okay, so my procedure is going to beat off some illustrations one after another, and only a very little theoretical argument, following in Wittgenstein's footsteps there. These illustrations are going to be respectively of the phenomenon of seeing as, or more broadly, as I refer to it, experiencing as. Also of seeing as occasioned by particular values, and then two specific works of art, one by Kiefer and one visual art by Kiefer, Anselm Kiefer, and a poem by Paul Celan. Okay, so seeing as. Seeing as is features ubiquitously in Wittgenstein's later work. As I understand it, it picks out a distinctive species of perception, a non-inferential experience of a work's subject or referent as possessing some kind of configurational feature or property. So the basic phenomenon of seeing as is standardly illustrated by this figure, the duster duck rabbit, and that's a simple image which illustrates the key point that seeing as is a mixture of direct perception and interpretation, of experiencing something, this particular figure on the page, as possessing a given pattern property or configurational property. And in virtue of presenting that aspect being a thing of a given kind, either it belongs to the kind duck picture or it belongs to the kind rabbit picture. The next one. Now, seeing as can sometimes work also metaphorically. We sometimes experience something metaphorically as something else. So here's one example from Francisco de Zelberan's Pots, which many viewers metaphorically see as people. So you look at the pots and you see them as different figures. Likewise, next slide, one can metaphorically experience the tree, Caspar David Friedrich's tree, as an isolated and morose figure in the landscape. So I'm going to ask you to extend the very familiar notion of seeing as that's illustrated by the duck rabbit into a broader notion of perceiving as, with a suitably broad understanding of perception, and experiencing as, which I'll be talking about for the next little while. So the properties we experience as are aspectual ones, or aspects as I'll refer to them. And I'm going to spare you the metaphysics of aspects, which is this slide here. We'll move on, right, to my first case study, as it were. And it's a fictional case study that's drawn from Tolstoy's wonderful book, Anna Karenina. Tolstoy was a favorite author of Wittgenstein, so I think it's an appropriate choice. And there's this terrific passage in Anna Karenina in which the vapid Count Vronsky contemplates a portrait of Anna that's being painted by Mihailov, an artist famed for his talent and insight. And this is the passage. I'll just read it. By the fifth sitting, Mihailov's portrait struck everybody, especially Vronsky, by its accurate likeness as well as its particular beauty. It was strange how Mihailov could have discovered that peculiar beauty. One must know her and love her as I have done to understand that sweet spiritual expression of hers, Vronsky thought, though it was only through this portrait that he himself had discovered it. But the expression was so true that it seemed to him and to others that they had always known it. So this is a wonderful spelling out of what it is to experience a work of art as presenting some evaluative property. In this case, the evaluative properties of the sweetness and spirituality of Anna's expression and character. So, if you indulge me in just a little bit of philosophizing here, so that one thing to appreciate that Tolstoy picks up on in that passage is that Vronsky is having a direct and non-inferential experience of Anna as possessing these properties of sweetness and spirituality. He's not looking at Mihailov's portrait and then finding himself imagining that, hey, Anna actually has these inner qualities. That's not what's going on. He sees directly Anna's sweet spiritual expression in and through the portrait. So experiencing as is not just perceptual experience of a material world with a layer of conceptual elaboration and interpretation on top. Right? What is seen, the aspects that are seen in and through the perceptible object. So the way in which Vronsky conceives of Anna at this moment is internal to his experience. Secondly, the property that Vronsky experiences Anna as possessing is inherently valenced, positive or negative, and evaluative. And this is really very common with works of art. The experiencing as that they solicit often target not only emotional, but moral and aesthetic and spiritual properties. Thus, Vronsky does not so much discover that Anna wears this characteristic expression as he discovers, through looking at Mihailov's portrait, its evaluative character. He discovers the value of these qualities in Anna by seeing them manifested in the portrait and its sweet, transcendent quality. Third point about experiencing as that Tolstoy illustrates here. His passage reminds us that when a work presents a valenced property in this way, it may be one which we had previously failed to notice. It can be an avenue of discovery. So Vronsky wonders at how Mihailov could have discovered Anna's peculiar beauty, but of course it's Vronsky too who sees it for the first time. And then finally, Tolstoy refers to Mihailov's painting in epistemic terms, that is, terms that have to do with belief and knowledge. The expression he has presented is described as true to how Anna really is. And this suggests that not only that Tolstoy was uncorrupted by analytic philosophy, but that experiencing as has epistemic value. It's a way of discerning what is really already there to be seen, but had been previously unnoted. So to sum up, Mihailov has used his mastery of artistic form to configure the spectator's experience of Anna and enabling the spectator, in this case Vronsky, to perceive and appreciate, first personally, a range of important evaluative properties. And on my view of the potential of works of art, this is actually an ubiquitous phenomenon. Successful works of art quite generally aid our perception of unfamiliar, sometimes radically alien, evaluative features of the world. Okay, so I'm going to try to back up that suggestion with another case study, as it were. Okay, so this is At the Mind's Limit, an essay by Jean Amery. It's a memoir and commentary. Amery is perhaps familiar to all of you. He's buried here in Vienna in a grave of honor. He was a Belgian resistance operator who was arrested and imprisoned, first in local jails in Belgium, then in Buchenwald, and then in Auschwitz, and finally in Bergen-Belsen. And eventually, he survived more than 3 years of torture and incarceration. He took his own life in 1978. His experiences while incarcerated, unsurprisingly, had a profound effect on his understanding of human nature and of our moral natures in particular. And this passage is one in which he refers to a theme that appears over and over again in his essay, the idea of losing trust in the world, and in also losing trust in others. At the Mind's Limit is an attempt by Amory to articulate in a mix of descriptive prose and quasi-philosophical concepts the persisting psychological effects of his wartime experience. The most profound of these effects is mentioned in this passage, a loss of trust in the world. Sometimes he refers to as loss of confidence. And what he lost, as you read through the essay, what you find he lost was trust or confidence in the world of ordinary moral distinctions, the difference between right and wrong, between what's permissible and what's impermissible. The basic moral grammar governing human interactions and giving rise to a host of everyday expectations regarding others' conduct. Amory compares this loss of confidence to the unreflective trust we normally invest in the most fundamental and general laws of nature, like the law of gravity. He says, trust in the world includes all sorts of things. The irrational and logically unjustifiable belief in absolute causality, right? Or the likewise blind belief in the validity of inductive inference. As Amory goes on to say, it also includes trust that the other person will sometimes spare me. Amory's traumatic experience left him guided not by these usual, by the familiar moral framework, but as he says, by fear and resentment. His loss of trust is a vivid instance of detachment from an intelligible, shared moral framework or form of life, what I have called moral estrangement, for want of a better phrase. In moral estrangement, the foundations of a person's ethical worldview are undermined. So Amory observes, for instance, that in his prisons, thought nullified itself when at almost every step it ran into uncrossable borders. The axes of its traditional frames of reference shattered. So moral estrangement is not just a matter of what all of us experience, namely changing our particular attitudes or views about this or that ethical commitment. It's not a matter of coming to revise your ethical, political, and personal evaluations. Rather, it's a matter of one's fundamental framework, the background assumptions and expectations, the unquestioned pre-reflective background of practices being transformed. So consider the extent to which confidence in one another intuitively regulates our everyday lives. As a pedestrian walking around Vienna, you expect that you will not be whimsically run down by a motorist, and that if you are, a passerby will take note and probably come to your aid. Likewise, a mother guiding her small child through a crowded marketplace expects that others will not trample him underfoot, and that if someone did, another person would intervene, and so forth. A world in which these conditions, these everyday conditions, manifestly go unsatisfied, as they did for Amory, is one governed by a different form of life. It is a world in which it's no longer possible to say what many of our canonical concepts even mean, concepts such as respect and dignity, and the collective sensibility we gesture at with the term humanity. As Amory writes, you do not observe dehumanized man committing his deeds and misdeeds without having all of your notions of inherent human dignity placed in doubt. And later, he comments, we emerged robbed and emptied, disoriented, and it was a long time before we were even able to learn the ordinary language of freedom. And still today, we speak it with discomfort and without real trust in its validity. So this is moral estrangement, as I'm using that phrase. And I've made these 2 points. It's an alteration at a fundamental or foundational level, not a matter of adjusting particular beliefs and particular evaluations, but the very fundamental concepts that, in terms of which we think about the meaning and value of our experiences and those who populate them is altered. It's also a transitional psychological phenomenon. It's a departure from a condition of coherence and commonality to a condition of isolation and incomprehension. So, as a commentator on the essay put it, it's one thing to be an excluded outsider, it's another to be an outsider who was previously an insider of a given form of life. Because one is then divorced not only from others, but from one's former self. The survivor, Amory says, is cut off not only from the world, but from the person he once was. His estrangement separates him not just from others, but from his own past identity. So Amory attempts to communicate all of this in descriptions, in analysis. He relies on sometimes concepts drawn from academic philosophy, from psychology, and does his best in this moving essay to articulate, to say what it is to no longer inhabit the everyday forms of moral life that that are fundamental to community life and to social interaction. So one has to ask at the end of the essay, how well does he succeed in conveying his experience? And I think as impressive as it is, it doesn't so much leave the reader with the feeling that he understands what the author experienced as the conviction that one can never truly understand the transformations that were effected. What it is to live as one morally estranged is, in this sense, strictly speaking, ineffable. So, in this regard, the title of his essay, At the Mind's Limit, is appropriate not only to what Amory endured through his incarceration, but also to what he endured as a survivor until taking his own life. The isolation that is imposed by the limits of intelligibility, by the fact that the moral world he'd come to inhabit was simply inexpressible to others and invisible to anyone who continued to be at home with the everyday conventional forms. So this is related to a point that was famously made by Adorno, but a more optimistic response is perhaps offered by some works of art. Certainly it's been a traditional motivation for artistry to give voice to one's experience precisely when one is most removed and isolated from a common framework. So I'm now going to look at a couple of specific works of art that I think make some progress in this respect, and offer, if only episodically and partially, an experience by showing us, showing the spectator, a kind of radical subversion of fundamental values, giving the spectator a sense of what it is to encounter moral estrangement. So the first is an exhibition that was presented in the Millennium Year in Paris by Kiefer, called Cheveret HaKalem, that's the breaking of the vases. And it was, I just stumbled across it accidentally when I was there, and it's, I think, one of the most impressive exhibitions I've ever seen. So he installed a big multifaceted installation in the Chapel Saint-Louis of Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris. The structure, the chapel structure, was once the official place of worship for this vast Hôpital Salpêtrière. Now, the Hôpital, interestingly, was a sort of notorious institution for centuries. It served principally as a kind of final posting and prison for those residents of Paris who were regarded as beyond all hope. The destitute, the diseased, dying street prostitutes, the mentally defective, epileptics, and the criminally insane were all sent together to see out their days in the in Salpêtrière. The chapel that is attached to it was commissioned by Louis XIV and dates from 1675. It fell into complete disuse and was abandoned in the 20th century. And what was left behind is a really remarkable space constructed in the shape of a cross. Let's see, can we go back? So it's constructed in the shape of a cross with this amazing dome at its center. And we'll just go through, Dory, in a few slides here. So this is the facade of it. And you can see it's a very austere building. Inside, it is flooded with light, partly because of the central dome. This is a photograph from when it was still in use, right? And as you can see, there's the usual iconography and paintings, altar candles, and the rest. This is an image of one of the passages after it was abandoned. Again here, empty, and that's the dome, which is still in place and floods it in a kind of cross-shaped light. And what Kiefer did, so we now have an image of part of his exhibition, was to leave the sanctuary completely bare, presenting a kind of vast desert scape as you enter until you reach the central nave, where he installed 5 enormous canvases in the arched wall spaces and numerous lead sculptures like these with which most of you are probably familiar. Formerly, the spaces that he was occupying with these works had displayed conventional Catholic iconography, images of Christ, the Virgin, the Apostles, the saints, and so forth. Kiefer's canvases, by contrast, were images of desolation and ruin. They're visions of a devastated post-apocalyptic world in which no living thing survives. We can move on. So we have some of the lead books here, and these are the images that were installed where the religious iconography would have been. I'm sorry about the quality of the images. They're taken, some of these are taken from the catalog. So you can interpret them in different ways, perhaps as images of our future world destroyed by our own technological innovations. They might equally represent the recent morally desolate past of Kiefer's German homeland. In the shadowy side chapels, we had the sculptures, the lead books and sculptures of gray-black cast iron, some twisted into unrecognizable shapes. From the spectator's perspective at the center of the nave, these deliver overall the impression of being surrounded by a landscape of tangled wreckage, both physical and psychological. And that fits well with the title of the exhibition. Chevrit HaKalim is a Hebrew phrase roughly translated as the breaking of the vessels or the vases, and it refers to an ancient Hebraic telling of the creation of the world in which the vessels that are intended to contain the light of God shatter because they're overwhelmed and overfilled by his greatness. And in the traditional story of Genesis, of course, in the Torah, man himself is this vessel, and he too proves to be too fragile, too mortal, and too weak to preserve the godliness within him. Like the clay vessels, he shatters. Kiefer's choice of this disused chapel to display his scenes of devastation, of course, is no accident. I visited the chapel a few years later. It's now mostly used for exhibitions and cultural events, but when I saw it in, I think it was 2003, it was simply an abandoned space. And the atmosphere of abandonment there is palpable. For even the most irreligious visitor can't but feel the absences haunting it. The absence of priests, of worshipers, of voices and gestures and text, of better imagined worlds, and of spiritual hopes. It's become a kind of monument to the absence of the sacred. And so Kiefer was occupying this ghost chapel, what was once a divine space, a house of God, and filling it with a constellation of spiritual and social losses. So I would argue that anyone who has had just the everyday, ordinary experience of entering religious spaces, Christian or otherwise, that are in use and alive and fulfilling their function, can't but experience this chapel as a kind of desecration. It's impossible not to sense the wrongness emanating from the displacement of the usual religious paintings. And even if someone has never really reflected on the contemporary significance of chapels, it's difficult not to follow Kiefer in his transformation of the space, at least that far. To see that, to be compelled, at least in part, to experience it as a kind of mausoleum of forsaken ideals. It's probably also worth noting that this particular hospital, sanatorium, had a sinister and morally ambiguous past. Hospitals are officially places where physical destruction, illness, is combated and deferred, and where ailments are cured, and where people who are threatened with death are given hope of life. But on this level, the chapel of the Hôpital Salpêtrière is, or once was, supposed to be a locus of spiritual healing, and within, a complex devoted to bodily healing. Unofficially, however, it was never anything of the kind. It was a place of persecution and hopelessness. It was the terminus of the downward spiral into absolute exclusion from the community, and some might feel from God, because most who entered the Hôpital would never escape. And there's no promise of healing in Kiefer's work. Okay, so let's return to, this is a last image, actually, one of the most moving, in which Kiefer uses old-fashioned, sort of mid-century children's night dresses as part of a collage in his work, with symbolism that I needn't spell out to you. So, going back to Wittgenstein, I'd want to say that the power of this work of art is that, unlike mere imaginings or describings, unlike anything we can say, the attentive viewer can experience something in a way that's not subject to rational control and has less to do with beliefs than with dispositions and responses to the deliverances, the immediate deliverances of our senses. So for those spectators who find Kiefer's work successful, as I did, they're compelled to take up the experiential point of view of someone who both believes and doubts, who enters a space of prayer and who finds that God has abandoned it. So in works of visual art like this, we find our experiencing as compelled. Like Vronsky, we can't but see what the artist puts before our eyes. Poetry, by contrast, has only words with which to work. And so one might wonder whether something like an extension of the concept of seeing as to experiencing as might work to characterize the effect of linguistic art, of poetry. And I'm going to very quickly, you've been extremely patient, I'm going to quickly make a case that moral estrangement, which is the evaluative aspect that we're focusing on, is quite brilliantly captured, and in a way that is analogous to Kiefer's presentation of moral estrangement at the Salpêtrière chapel. And this is in Ceylon's poem Psalm. So Ceylon is best known for poems that arise from an address, his experience of Nazi oppression. Like Amory and several other survivor authors, he returned to these concerns in his writing over and over again. There's a particular collection, Die Niemandrose, which was published in 1963. John Feldsteiner, Ceylon's biographer, says that this collection as a whole presents the reader with the problem of poetic intelligibility, not least because of the numerous allusions to specific places and people and events of private biographical import to Ceylon. At the same time, the collection as a whole possesses an overall affective tone and complex of imagery that delivers a sort of vivid, cumulative effect, a tone of wistfulness and longing, of occasional hopes restrained by regretful and resentful reminiscences of what is past. I think one of the most successful poems in the collection is this one, Psalm. And I'm sorry to be addressing German speakers here and offering you a translation. It's a kind of, you might think, offense against the work itself, but that's the language in which I must work. So in the collection overall, Ceylon is arguably kind of charting the transition of a European community moving from a world that was underwritten by faith, by tradition, and by divine election to a nihilistic one of moral and spiritual chaos. And I think Psalm does this in the plainest and most desolate of terms. It reads, "No one conjures our dust, no one. Praised be your name, no one. For your sake we shall flower towards you. A nothing we are, shall remain, flowering, the nothing, the no one's rose, with our pistil soul bright, with our stamen heaven ravaged, our corolla red, with the crimson word which we sang over, oh, over the thorn." So I think few readers familiar with the rhythm and imagery of the biblical psalms, whether Jewish or Christian, can fail to feel here the sting of Ceylon's mockery. The opening, in a way analogous to Kiefer mocking the hopes and aspirations that informed religious forms of life, right? Putting his own very different objects in an abandoned chapel. Ceylon is inhabiting some of the images and rhythms of religious song. The opening lines voice the bitterness of the once faithful, who are themselves now mocked by indifference and even brutality of an absent God. We hear the soothing, just an echo of the soothing pastoral image of the 23rd Psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd," hovering in the background, reminding us that this speaker is not led beside still waters or invited to lie down in green pastures. His soul is not being restored forever, and he will not be reborn, let alone live in the house of the Lord forever. There are no future paradises awaiting the dead. As Psalm moves into the second and third stanzas, we find that, far from being the objects of divine love, endowed with immortality, humanity is nature's short-lived decoration, a beautiful amusement for the divine. No one, flowering towards nothing, for the sake of, no point and no purpose. Like the cherished rose, a human being is a bright, beautiful, and magical thing, but he is not thereby protected and loved. He's no one's rose. Indeed, the rose's life-generating and reproductive characteristics, the pistil, the stamen, the soft corolla, are at once the sources and subjects of brutal violence. They're heaven-ravaged. They're colored the color of blood. They're stained by the crimson word. The prayers and psalms of our spiritual traditions. So in this absurd and demonic world of no one's rose, the only object of our prayers can be the thorn, that part of ourselves promising injury and pain to anyone who dares to come too close to us. I'll just say a little bit more about this, and then I'm going to wrap up. I think by Ceylon's interweaving of the contradictory form and content, again, locating his words in these structures and alluding to images of traditional psalms. In doing this, I think he succeeds in moving the sensitive reader at a very immediate and pre-reflective experiential level. The bitterness of the abandoned believer is conveyed viscerally, not just represented semantically. Psalm is undeniably a striking expression of spiritual and moral estrangement. But it's also more than that, because it succeeds in offering the reader himself an episodic experience of what it is to exist under the specter of such estrangement, to inhabit the world of one estranged from supportive forms of life, to find that one's only existing forms of spiritual expression arise from and belong to the very world that one has left behind. Like Kiefer's installation, it does this in part by recollecting the background within which our more familiar values have arisen, excavating and exploiting the symbols, the rhythms, rituals, and vocabulary that make up the fabric of our everyday moral norms, a fabric that is often invisible to us even as it unravels. In this respect, I think the poem does its work in a psychological terrain that is between perception and linguistic conception. It allows the attuned reader to experience a psalm of faith and hope as at the same time a song of estrangement. Okay, so we'll move on to the next slides. Just want to point out some isomorphisms between the way in which the Kiefer installation works and the way in which Ceylon's poem works. Isomorphisms which are to some extent generalizable. We'll go back to the isomorphisms. Yeah, so poetry is often expressive of these distinctive ways of experiencing as, and enables experiencing as and experience taking, but not through sensory perception. The perception that occurs through poetry is at the level of association, affective association, linguistic association, memory, perceptual imagination. And it's no accident that poetry is often associated with images, and that its language is figurative language, the rendering of figures, because it is, when effective, transforming not just ways of thinking about or interpreting aspects of human experience, but allowing us a first personal encounter with different aspects which the poem allows us to see. Okay, so I'm really said everything I have to say on this. If this were a philosophy lecture, you'd now have to hear a lot more about the epistemic value of art in this context, but we won't be doing that. So I've tried to show how these three themes, seeing aspects, experiencing as, feature in our understanding and appreciation of works of art. I haven't said a lot about the distinction between saying and showing, but I tried to illustrate that with the contrast between Amory's attempt on this very elusive phenomenon of moral estrangement and the attempts that are made by Kiefer and Ceylon on a similar one, and the idea that we participate in forms of life that are forms of life only within which our concepts and our percepts are intelligible. The works of art that we looked at were specifically attempting to reconstruct or recreate, or to create in an innovative way a world in which different and novel alien forms of life come to govern the viewer's experience. So thank you very much.